Season 4 of Dexter had garnered widespread acclaim, as evidenced by its impressive 9.1 out of 10 IMDb rating. Now, we all know that Dokes, Lundy, and perhaps Quinn had some idea that Dexter might have had some sort of a dark side to him. In fact, Dexter himself was able to spot the darkness in other people and his victims. Sort of a "it takes one to know one" situation. So then why did the Trinity killer, or Arthur, never seem to have noticed Dexter for who he truly was? To answer this question, we're going to look at this scene by scene. Now, some of Dexter's villains are complete psychopaths. Take his brother Brian, for example. Even Dexter himself believed he was a psychopath for much of his life. But as the series goes on, we start to see that isn't entirely true. He begins to show real emotion, even empathy, especially for the people he genuinely cares about. In fact, Dr. Vogel makes this clear in the final season, describing him as a partial psychopath rather than a complete one. Words like psychopath and sociopath gets thrown around a lot these days. By definition, a psychopath is cold, detached, and calculating. They don't feel empathy, they don't feel guilt, their killings are completely separated from emotion. They can mimic charm, but deep down, they don't attach to people at all. A sociopath, on the other hand, is emotional, volatile. They can love, they can feel guilt, and they can even punish themselves for their actions. But when the switch flips, they're just as dangerous as any psychopath. So unlike a psychopath, a sociopath still has some sense of empathy, morality, and even conscience, but it's limited. They often struggle to feel these things consistently, or extend them to people outside their closest circle. And where psychopaths are typically cold, manipulative, and highly calculated in their methods, sociopaths can be impulsive, reckless, and hot-tempered. At the very start of Season 4, we hear Agent Lundy discussing the infamous Trinity case. As his words echo, the scene slowly shifts to an abandoned building, where we see Arthur Mitchell, naked and trembling, taking a scalding hot shower while sobbing. It isn't just about cleansing, it's almost biblical, as if he's trying to burn away his sins in hellfire. At first, it seems strange, but this detail becomes more important later, hinting at the guilt and torment buried beneath his ritual killings. Meanwhile, Dexter begins to meticulously follow Arthur, only to discover a man who, on the surface, lives a perfectly normal life. The shock comes when Dexter sees him embracing his family, playing the role of a loving husband and father. Fascinated, Dexter begins to wonder, could Arthur hold the secret to balancing a family life while still feeding the dark passenger? Of course, the more he gets to know Arthur, the more we end up hating him. This is where both Dexter and the audience begin to see just how complex Trinity's psyche really is. Their first face-to-face encounter happens right after a Sunday sermon. Arthur has just finished preaching his wholesome, almost saint-like persona to the congregation when Dexter, posing as Kyle Butler, steps in to introduce himself. And here, Dexter gives him the signature dark passenger stare. It's that look he's given to killers before, as if to silently say, "I know exactly who you are, Arthur." But what's fascinating is that Arthur doesn't pick up on it at all. He seems completely oblivious, even welcoming. For a man who's supposed to be a meticulous serial killer, this is unusual, because a true psychopath never lets their guard down. They're always suspicious, always probing beneath the surface. Arthur, however, doesn't. Their next major interaction happens during the church's home-building charity project, where Arthur brings Dexter along to collect wood. Out in the wilderness, their truck hits a deer and injures it. The injured deer, too late to be saved, is lying on the ground. It's a moment that should feel natural for a hunter like Arthur, quick, clean, merciful. But instead, we see him freeze. His hands shake, and he genuinely looks horrified at the idea of killing the animal. Dexter, meanwhile, watches closely, expecting to glimpse that same darkness in Arthur that he carries in himself. But there's nothing. No cold resolve, no predator's instinct, not even the detached calm you'd expect from a seasoned killer. What we see instead is fear, pure human fear. For Dexter and the audience, this is baffling. How could a man responsible for over 30 murders tremble at the thought of ending the suffering of a deer? And this hesitation, empathy, and fear is our first real clue that he isn't a classic psychopath, but something far messier and more human. This is where we get reminded of the scene where he is crying and punishing himself with the scalding hot shower. We see him truly break down with remorse and guilt. His deep religious faith makes these moments feel less like cleansing and more like punishment, almost a self-inflicted penance. And this is crucial because it's our first clear sign that Arthur isn't a true psychopath. A psychopath doesn't feel genuine guilt or remorse, but Arthur does. We see it in his trembling, in his hesitation, in the way he recoils from the weight of his own actions. This points us toward understanding him as a sociopath, a man who can feel emotions like guilt, remorse, and even empathy, though only in a fractured and limited way. That's why his hesitation with the deer earlier rings true. Because it wasn't part of his ritualistic cycle, he couldn't compartmentalize it. The empathy he felt in that moment was real. On the rooftop, Arthur reaches his breaking point. Shaking and overwhelmed, he's ready to throw himself off the building, his despair finally overtaking him. But Dexter intervenes, not out of compassion, but because his dark passenger isn't ready to let go of Arthur just yet. He wants to study him, to learn from him, to eventually claim him. When Dexter pulls Arthur back to safety, Arthur doesn't see it as chance or coincidence. Instead, he interprets it as divine intervention, proof that God himself sent Dexter, or rather Kyle Butler, into his life for a reason. And this moment is key. It shows us that Arthur's faith, his larger-than-life worldview, isn't just a mask he wears to fit into society. Unlike Dexter, who carefully crafts his facade to appear normal, Arthur genuinely believes in destiny, in divine will, in punishment and redemption. And this is where Dexter realizes he isn't dealing with a mirror of himself, but with something else entirely. A different kind of monster, one driven not by cold calculation, but by faith, guilt, and delusion. Even after all this, Dexter still couldn't get a true glimpse into the darkness inside Arthur. That mystery kept pulling him deeper, pushing him to stay involved in Arthur's life. On the other side, Arthur wasn't just hiding his sins. He was actively trying to shape Kyle's life, bringing faith into the picture as if it could spark some kind of positive change. In his mind, maybe helping Kyle was a way to balance the scales, to pay penance, or even to fulfill what he believed a higher power demanded of him. During the road trip, there's a pivotal moment when Kyle admits to Arthur that he's killed someone. This feels like a turning point in their relationship, a subtle acknowledgement of the darkness each carries. For Dexter, it's a test, a measure of how Arthur reacts to true evil. And yet, even here, Arthur remains largely oblivious. He doesn't recognize the full extent of the monster standing in front of him. Instead, he interprets Dexter's confession through the lens of his own worldview, perhaps as a confession seeking guidance, redemption, or even to fulfill what he believed a higher power demanded of him. This also makes Arthur comfortable in their relationship. He decides it's time for Dexter to see some of his traumatic past, So he takes Dexter to his childhood home and tries to describe everything that happened. In this situation, we can also see that Arthur gets emotionally volatile as he speaks about his sister's death, mother's suicide, and abuse from their father. This makes the people already living in the house uncomfortable. This is where we get to observe that Arthur is not the one to be methodical or trying to lay low person to blend in with society. Psychopaths try to do things discreetly, trying not to attract any attention towards them. During the infamous Thanksgiving dinner episode, Arthur's emotional volatility becomes even more evident. His inability to control his temper stands out when Jonah, his son, carelessly tries to destroy Vera's ashes. Arthur's reaction is intense and almost self-centered. He's consumed more by his own trauma and the anger it triggers, rather than empathy for anyone else at the table. The scene makes it clear that his emotions are raw and deeply personal, rather than measured or strategic. Even Dexter, who has been carefully observing and trying to stay under the radar, realizes he can't simply sit back this time. He has to intervene to prevent the situation from spiraling further. Later, when Dexter returns to his own Thanksgiving dinner, the contrast hits him immediately. The room is calm, peaceful, family laughter, routine chaos, the simple warmth of normalcy. In that moment, Dexter reflects on himself and realizes he isn't the kind of monster Trinity is. This juxtaposition highlights a key pattern throughout the season. Dexter's dark passenger constantly tries to gaslight him, which is a pattern throughout the show, whispering that what he does is justified, that his killings are controlled, necessary, and for the greater good. Yet, when he observes Trinity, he sees a man whose darkness is entwined with guilt, faith, and emotional volatility, a darkness that consumes rather than controls. It's also what solidifies the way audience keep rooting for him the rest of the show. Otherwise, if Dexter was a complete psychopath and just a shitty person in general, it would not be possible for the audience to root for him all through these seasons. Eventually, Trinity begins to grow cocky, emboldened by the fact that Dexter saved him from death on the rooftop. This newfound confidence leads him to kill outside of his usual ritualistic cycle. For example, the man posing as Kyle Butler, whom he brutally bludgeons to death. Yet even in these deviations, there's a restraint to his madness. Arthur doesn't kill indiscriminately. He still seems guided by a sense of necessity, doing only what he believes must be done. This restraint, however, is different from Dexter's calculated control. Trinity's actions are driven by a volatile mix of ego, guilt, and distorted faith. A reminder that, unlike a true psychopath who manipulates and plans meticulously, Arthur is a sociopath with limited emotional regulation. His darkness is unpredictable, human, and terrifying precisely because it is tethered to his emotions, not just his urges. This is also why, at the end of the season, Trinity spares Harrison but kills Rita. Rita doesn't belong to his ritualistic kill cycle, yet Arthur knows that taking her life will inflict the deepest possible pain on Dexter. Even in this act of calculated cruelty, it's still filtered through his own sense of distorted necessity rather than cold, methodical malice. When Dexter finally confronts and kills him, Arthur remains strangely oblivious or indifferent to Dexter's dark passenger. Instead, he rambles about how it's all part of God's elaborate plan, consumed by his tangled mix of faith, guilt, and confusion. In his final moments, we see a man entirely governed by his own conflicted emotions, a sociopath with a limited yet potent range of feelings, utterly human in his turmoil, and terrifying in his unpredictability.
Is this who you are?
Ta-da!
overall. While many viewers may dislike Trinity or feel frustrated that Dexter didn't kill him off the first chance, Arthur Mitchell is a deeply layered character. His complexity, his guilt, faith, rituals, and emotional volatility makes him far more than a typical villain. More importantly, Trinity's presence sets the stage for the audience to root for Dexter. Without a villain who challenges him in such profound and morally complex ways, the show couldn't have maintained its tension or carried its narrative across multiple seasons. If Dexter had been a perfect psychopath, utterly cold and unrelatable, it would not be possible for the audience to root for him all these seasons. It's the gray areas in both Trinity's and Dexter's psyches, the mix of darkness, morality, and human emotion that makes Season 4 not just memorable, but truly exceptional.